Abigail Mercer slammed both fists against the council table so hard that the oil lamp rattled and 3 men flinched backward in their chairs. "You will not take this land from me," she said. Her voice didn't shake. Her jaw was set like iron. Her knuckles were bleeding from a fence repair she hadn't finished before riding into town, and she hadn't even stopped to bandage them. The room went silent. Every man in that chamber had expected a widow to come in weeping, begging, surrendering. Not one of them had expected this. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell and follow along until the very last word, because this story is far from over. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. She had buried a man she loved on a Tuesday in February in frozen ground that took 3 men with pickaxes nearly 2 hours to break open. She had not cried at the funeral. Not because she didn't love Thomas Mercer. She had loved him deeply wholly, with the kind of quiet devotion that doesn't announce itself in grand gestures, but instead shows up at 4 in the morning to help mend a broken fence or stay awake through a hard rain to make sure the cattle didn't drift. She hadn't cried because she was already calculating, already counting. The wood supply, the remaining feed, the debts she had not yet tallied, the neighbors who were watching her with expressions that made her stomach twist. Expressions she would only later recognize as anticipation. As if they were already preparing for what they assumed was inevitable. Abigail Mercer, folding, selling, disappearing. She had stood at that graveside in her best black dress, the one she had only worn twice before, and made herself a promise so fierce and so private that she hadn't spoken it aloud to a single soul since. "I will not disappear." That was 2 years ago. 2 years of pre-dawn mornings and cracked hands and meals she ate standing up because sitting down felt like surrendering to exhaustion. 2 years of learning things. Thomas had always handled negotiating feed prices with merchants who assumed a woman couldn't read a ledger, managing ranch hands who tested her authority every single week until she proved plainly and without drama that she knew exactly what she was doing. 2 years of neighbors suggesting gently at first, and then less gently, that she ought to consider selling. Consider remarrying. Consider making things easier on herself. She had smiled at each of them with a politeness that cost her everything and changed absolutely nothing about her plans. The Mercer land was hers. She had worked it with her own hands. She would keep it. It was a Wednesday morning in late April when Caleb Whitmore first saw her, though he would later admit he had heard about her before, that everyone in Willow Creek had heard about the widow who refused to quit, who went toe-to-toe with suppliers twice her size, and came out ahead, who could rope a steer faster than most men half her age, and didn't particularly care whether anyone was impressed. He had been riding through town on his way back from the feed merchant when he spotted her on the edge of the main road, crouched beside a wagon with a broken rear wheel, her sleeves already rolled to the elbow, her hat pushed back on her head, doing an assessment of the damage with the focused expression of someone who had already mentally cataloged 3 possible solutions and was currently deciding between them. 2 cowboys from the Harcourt Ranch were standing nearby, not helping, just watching the way men sometimes watched a woman struggle with something, as if the watching itself was a form of entertainment, or as if they were waiting to be asked so they could swoop in heroically. Abigail had not asked. She had not even looked at them. Caleb pulled his horse to a stop, swung down, looped the reins over a post, and walked over without announcing himself. He crouched down beside her, studied the wheel, and said, "The axle pin's sheared clean through. You'll need a replacement. I've got a spare in my saddlebag, been carrying it for 2 months after my own wheel gave out on the Billings Road." Abigail looked at him. She had the kind of eyes that evaluated things quickly and accurately. Gray-green sharp, not unfriendly, but not soft either. The eyes of a woman who had learned the hard way that most offers came attached to expectations. "I don't need," she started. "It'll take 10 minutes, Caleb said. He was already reaching into his saddlebag. "And before you tell me you can handle it yourself, I believe you. I've seen the Mercer Ranch. You've been handling things just fine." He glanced at her sideways. "But my axle pin is sitting right here doing nothing useful, and your wagon needs one, so it seems like poor stewardship of resources to make this complicated." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." Those were the first words Abigail Mercer ever spoke to Caleb Whitmore. "All right. Not thank you. Not an introduction. Just a practical no-nonsense acceptance of a logical solution." He liked her immediately. They worked side by side for the next 10 minutes, without much conversation. Him holding the axle steady, her fitting the pin. Both of them moving with the efficient shorthand of people who were accustomed to working alone, and therefore didn't waste motion. When it was done, Abigail brushed her hands on her trousers, and looked at the wheel with the brief, quiet satisfaction of a job completed. "Thank you," she said. "My pleasure, ma'am." She started to turn back toward the wagon seat. Then she paused as if something had occurred to her, and turned back. "I don't believe I know you." "Caleb Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat. "I run the Three Pines spread about 6 miles north of your property line." "I know the land," she said. "Good grass up there." "It is. I've been lucky with it." She studied him for another moment, in that direct assessing way of hers. Then she nodded once. It's the same way you might close a ledger after confirming the numbers were correct, and climbed back up onto the wagon seat. "Those two from Harcourt's," Caleb said, nodding toward the cowboys who were still watching from a distance, now looking slightly put out that the drama had resolved without them. They were probably going to fight each other for the chance to help you. Abigail glanced at them with the mild, distant expression of someone acknowledging the weather. "They've been standing there for 20 minutes, she said. "If they were going to help, they would have." Caleb looked at them, looked back at her. Fair point. And then, because he was Caleb Whitmore and couldn't quite stop himself, he said, "Well, when you do decide to accept company, at least you'll have saved me from having to duel anyone for the privilege." The corner of Abigail's mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something more careful than that, more guarded, like a door opening half an inch to check what was on the other side. But it was there. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. And she drove away. He watched her go. One of the Harcourt cowboys sauntered over, grinning. "You sweet on the Mercer widow Whitmore." "I'm observant," Caleb said pleasantly. "There's a difference." And he untied his horse and rode on. But he thought about her for the rest of the day. The thing was, Willow Creek had an opinion about Abigail Mercer. It had several opinions, in fact, the way small frontier towns tend to develop opinions about women who don't behave the way they're expected to. The most common opinion was pity, which Abigail tolerated with barely concealed impatience. Thomas Mercer had died doing something foolish, crossing a half-frozen creek in February, when any sensible man would have gone around, and the town had initially responded with the warm, smothering sympathy that small communities deploy like a blanket, well-intentioned and entirely suffocating. They had brought food. They had offered help. They had visited. And then, when it became clear that Abigail was not going to grieve on a schedule that made them comfortable, was not going to sell the ranch and move to her sister's place in Denver, was not going to accept any of the 3 proposals that came within the first year, from men who had looked at a struggling widow's land and seen an opportunity dressed up as charity, then the sympathy had curdled just slightly at the edges. Not into hostility. Nothing so overt. Just into a kind of baffled irritation. She wasn't behaving correctly. She wasn't making things easy. That woman, Caleb had heard Doris Henshaw say once at the general store, with the particular tone of someone who considered herself an authority on proper widowhood, is going to work herself into an early grave out of sheer stubbornness. He had picked up his supplies and left without commenting, because there was nothing to say to that which wouldn't start an argument he had no interest in having. He started finding reasons to pass by the Mercer ranch. Not every day. Not even every week at first. Just occasionally. He would be riding the fence line and discover quite naturally, and without any particular planning, that the most logical route home took him past her property. He would stop if she was outside, which she almost always was, and they would talk. About cattle prices. About the weather. About the increasingly aggressive posture of the railroad company that was buying up land to the east and making everyone nervous. About practical, concrete, impersonal things that had nothing whatsoever to do with the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, or the way she laughed quickly, like she was surprised by it, like laughter was something that caught her off guard, and she hadn't quite made her peace with enjoying it. Abigail was, he discovered, deeply specifically funny. Not in a performative way, she didn't tell jokes or try to charm. But her observations about the world were so precise, so dry, so completely without sentimentality, that they consistently caught him off guard in a way that few things did. She had a gift for locating the exact absurdity at the center of any situation, and naming it plainly without fanfare, and then moving on, as if she hadn't just made him nearly choke on his coffee. Like the time, Reverend Pritchett had stopped by the ranch ostensibly to offer spiritual guidance, and spent 45 minutes hinting that a woman alone was vulnerable to moral corruption, and Abigail had listened to all of it with perfect patience, and then said mildly, "Reverend, I've been alone for 2 years, and the most morally complicated decision I've made is whether to charge Gus Henley more for that fence repair, since he clearly underpaid me the first time. I'll let you know if the temptation becomes too great." Caleb had been there for that one. He'd had to turn away to cough. "You've got a mean streak," he told her afterward. "I've got an accurate streak," she corrected. "There's a difference." That was the other thing about Abigail, she was precise about language. She pushed back on imprecision the way you'd push back on a fence post that wasn't set straight, not aggressively but firmly, and with the clear expectation that you'd get it right this time. Howe was sitting on her porch one late May evening, drinking the worst coffee he'd ever had in his life. She could run a ranch with clockwork efficiency and had absolutely no gift for anything involving a stove, when he made the mistake of saying casually that he'd heard she'd been struggling. She went very still. "Who said that?" He registered the shift immediately, the way her voice dropped a quarter tone and her posture changed from relaxed to precise. He had made a tactical error. "Just around town," he said. "That the costs have been higher than expected, and—" "I am not struggling," Abigail said. "Abigail, I am managing a situation that is temporarily more expensive than projected," she said. "I am recalibrating my approach in response to a difficult season. I am problem-solving, Caleb. That is entirely different from struggling." He looked at her. "Those sound like the same thing." "They are not the same thing," she said. "Struggling means you might give up. I will not give up, so I am not struggling." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a very specific distinction," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "Does it help?" he asked, keeping the word out of it, and for just a moment, one unguarded, honest moment, something moved across her face that wasn't the dry composure she generally wore like armor. Something that looked like exhaustion and determination and grief all tangled together in a way that she clearly hadn't intended to let him see. "Sometimes," she said quietly. "Sometimes it does." I didn't say anything else. He just sat there with her in the evening quiet, while the sun went down behind the hills, and neither of them moved, and the terrible coffee went cold. And it was in a way he couldn't quite explain even to himself one of the finest evenings he could remember in years. The problem was that Caleb Whitmore was, by his own honest assessment, not a man who was particularly good at wanting things he wasn't sure he could have. He had loved once before, or believed he had. Her name was Caroline, and she had been the kind of beautiful that entire rooms noticed, and she had chosen him for about 8 months before choosing instead a cattle baron from Billings with 3 times his acreage and a much more impressive hat collection. He had not been dramatic about it. He had not wallowed. He had simply recalibrated, to borrow Abigail's terminology. He had decided that attachment was a liability, and that he would focus on his land and his cattle and the things he could actually control. And that had worked perfectly well for 4 years, until one Wednesday morning when a woman with gray-green eyes and bloody knuckles from a fence repair had looked at him like she was reading a ledger and asked if he knew the Three Pines land. He had not been prepared for that at all. He was 41 years old and supposed to know better. He rode by the Mercer Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in early June and found Abigail sitting on the porch steps with a letter in her hands, and something about the way she was sitting very still, very upright, the letter held in both hands like it might try to escape, stopped him at the gate. "Abigail." She looked up. Her expression was controlled, but her jaw was too set, and there was a quality to the stillness that he recognized immediately as the particular stillness of someone who has received bad news and is in the process of deciding how to respond to it rather than actually responding to it yet. "Ride in," she said. He dismounted, tied his horse, walked up to the porch. She held out the letter without a word. He read it. It was from an attorney in Helena, representing a man named Victor Langley. The letter claimed that Thomas Mercer had entered into a business partnership with Langley prior to his death. That certain land parcels. The letter was careful and vague about which parcels specifically had been offered as collateral against a debt, and that in the event of Mercer's death, said collateral reverted to Langley's ownership. The letter was 3 pages long and buried the actual demand under so much legal language that you had to read it twice to understand what it was asking for. Abigail to vacate 40 acres of the most productive land on the property within 60 days. Caleb read it twice. He handed it back. "This is fabricated," he said. "Probably," Abigail said. "Thomas never mentioned a Langley. Not once." She folded the letter along its original creases with a care that was completely at odds with what was surely happening inside her. "I've been through every record Thomas kept. Every ledger, every contract, every piece of paper in this house. There is no record of any partnership with Victor Langley." "Then he's fishing," Caleb said. "He thinks a widow alone won't put up a fight. He thinks you'll see the legal language unfold." Abigail looked at him. Her expression for just a moment was so completely quietly furious that it made him take a half step back. "He's wrong," she said. "I know. I will need a lawyer. I know a man in Bozeman, good one, honest. He'll take this case." She was quiet for a moment. "I can't pay him what—" "He'll take it," Caleb said. "Langley's been doing this up and down the valley. James has been waiting for a case solid enough to go after him directly." He paused. This might be it. Abigail stood up. She put the letter in her apron pocket. She picked up her hat from the step beside her and put it on, and then she looked at the land, the hills, the cattle in the lower pasture, the fence she had rebuilt post by post with her own hands, with an expression that was absolutely unmistakably clear. Nobody was taking this from her. "All right," she said. "Tell me about this lawyer." What Caleb didn't tell her, what he didn't know yet, that Thursday afternoon was that when he started digging into Victor Langley's history, which he did that same evening, out of a combination of outrage and something else he wasn't ready to name, he would find something that changed the entire shape of the story. He contacted James Aldrich in Bozeman, who was indeed a good lawyer and an honest one, and who had indeed been tracking Langley for the better part of 2 years. Langley's method was consistent. He targeted properties with vulnerable ownership widows, older ranchers without heirs, families with complicated succession, manufactured a claim of prior debt or partnership, backed it with documents that looked legitimate at a glance, but became questionable under scrutiny, and then applied social and legal pressure until people gave up. Most people gave up. The legal cost was too high. The fight was too exhausting. The uncertainty was too destabilizing. "He counts on people not having the stomach for it," James said when Caleb rode to Bozeman and sat across from him in his small paper-stacked office. "And most of the time he's right." "Abigail Mercer has the stomach for it," Caleb said. James studied him across the desk. "You sure about that? It's going to get ugly. Langley doesn't lose quietly." "I'm sure," Caleb said. And he was with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the look on her face when she said, "Nobody is taking this from me," the absolute, unassailable conviction of a woman who had already lost more than most people could endure and had decided with complete clarity that she was done losing. What James told him next was what changed things. Among the cases James had been building against Langley, there was a pattern in at least 2 instances. Men who had been preparing to expose Langley's operations had experienced sudden devastating setbacks. A fire, a financial collapse that came out of nowhere. And in one case, a rancher named Hartley 2 years ago in the winter, a fatal accident. The kind of accident that on its own would look like misfortune. The kind of accident that in context started to look like something else entirely. Caleb rode home slowly. He was not a man given to dramatic conclusions. He didn't leap to worst-case interpretations or let his imagination run past what the evidence actually supported. But he was also not a man who ignored the shape of things when the shape was becoming clear. Thomas Mercer had died in a winter accident. Thomas Mercer had been a rancher with solid land and a reputation for honesty. Thomas Mercer had apparently been in some kind of conflict with Victor Langley. He sat with that for 3 days before he said anything to Abigail. He needed to be sure not that he was going to tell her, because she deserved to know whatever was true, but sure enough in his own mind that he wasn't handing her something that would upend her entire understanding of the last 2 years unless it was real. I went back through everything he could find. He talked to 2 merchants who had known Thomas. He wrote to a contact in Helena who knew Langley's business history. He asked careful questions of people who had been in Willow Creek the winter. Thomas died about the days before the accident, about whether Thomas had seemed troubled or preoccupied. What he assembled was not proof. He was clear-eyed about that. It was a pattern, a shape, a set of circumstances that pointed in a direction without arriving at a destination. But it was enough. He rode out to the Mercer Ranch on a Monday morning in late June and found Abigail in the barn doing a harness repair with the focused, no-nonsense efficiency that characterized everything she did. She looked up when he came in, registered his expression, and said immediately, "What's wrong?" "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you react." "That's never a good opening," she said, but she set down the harness and gave him her full attention. He told her about Langley's pattern, about the other accidents, about the merchant who had mentioned almost in passing that Thomas had been asking questions about a land purchase to the east, a few weeks before he died, questions that in retrospect sounded very much like the beginning of an investigation, about the shape that was forming when you put all of it together. He watched her face as he talked. She didn't interrupt. She didn't move. She stood very still in the way she had of going perfectly controlled when something was affecting her deeply, and she listened to every word with those gray-green eyes steady on his face. And when he was done, she was quiet for a long time. "You're saying Thomas might have been trying to expose him," she said finally. Her voice was even, carefully, deliberately even. "I'm saying it's possible. I'm not saying it's certain. The evidence isn't—" "You're saying Thomas might have died because of it." He held her gaze. "I'm saying I don't know, but I think we need James to look at it." Another silence. And then Abigail did something he hadn't expected. She sat down on a hay bale slowly, like her legs had decided the situation called for it, and put her face in her hands, not crying. He would learn over time that Abigail almost never cried in front of anyone. But her shoulders did something complicated, something that was about the weight of what he'd just handed her. Not just the threat to her land, not just the legal battle ahead, but the possibility that Thomas had died trying to do the right thing. That his death, which she had carried for 2 years as a senseless accident, might have been something else. That the story of her loss might be different than the one she had been telling herself. He crossed the barn and sat down on the hay bale beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't touch her. He just sat there close enough that she wasn't alone with it. After a while, she lifted her face from her hands. "If it's true," she said, "if Thomas was trying to stop him and Langley—" She stopped, started again. "Then stopping Langley isn't just about my land." "No," Caleb said. "It's not." "Then we stop him," Abigail said. "Completely. Whatever it takes." He looked at her. There were 100 things he could have said. He could have told her to be careful, could have suggested she let him and James handle the dangerous parts, could have done the thing that men especially, were inclined to do when a woman said something fierce, which was to gently redirect her toward a safer role. He said none of those things. "I figured you'd say that," he said. The smallest possible version of a smile crossed her face. "Then let's figure out how," she said. They stayed in that barn for 2 more hours, talking through everything Caleb had gathered, and everything they would need, and the shape of the fight ahead. Abigail asked sharp, specific questions, and absorbed every answer, and built from it, immediately adjusting her understanding and her planning in real time, with a speed and precision that reminded him again that she was not a woman who needed protection. She was a woman who needed a partner. At one point in the middle of a discussion about land records, she said, without looking up from the notes she was making, "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because it needs doing," he said. That's not an answer. It's the truest one I've got right now, he said. She did look up then, straight at him, with that direct ledger-reading gaze that missed nothing. Caleb, she said, carefully, I need to say something to you. All right. I'm not. She stopped, tried again. 2 years is not a very long time, and I'm not finished being whatever I am right now. And I don't know what's on the other side of this, the legal fight, the truth about Thomas, any of it. I don't know who I'll be when it's over. I know, he said. I can't make any, Abigail. He kept his voice level and kind and absolutely clear. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not here because I expect something back. I'm here because I want to be, and because the situation calls for it, and because... He stopped. Because there was a third reason that was truer than the other two, and he wasn't sure he had the right to say it yet. And because I think you're worth knowing. That's all. That's the whole of it. She looked at him for a long time. I can't, she said, quietly, not cruelly, just honestly. I can't be what... You don't have to be anything, he said. Just let me help. As a neighbor, that's sufficient. She was silent. As a neighbor, she repeated finally. Completely without ulterior motive, he said, straight-faced. I do this for all my neighbors. And there it was again, that quick, surprised, almost against her will laugh that he was beginning to suspect was one of the rarest and most valuable things in Willow Creek, Montana. You're a terrible liar, she said. Spectacular liar, he corrected. You just see through it, which is different, and something shifted between them that evening. Nothing resolved. Nothing, promised nothing, that either of them would have known how to name. Just a door that had been shut very firmly for a very long time, opening the smallest, most provisional, most careful inch. Outside, the Montana sky had gone dark, and the stars were coming up over the hills, and the land that someone wanted to steal from her lay quiet and silver, and absolutely irrevocably hers. Abigail Mercer looked out at it. She had survived 2 years of grinding, exhausting, unrelenting difficulty by refusing to believe the word struggling applied to her. Now standing at the beginning of a fight that was bigger and darker and more complicated than anything she had faced before, she felt to her own considerable surprise. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not frightened. Not alone. Something almost like ready. The letter from Victor Langley's attorney sat on Abigail's kitchen table for exactly 48 hours before she did something about it. She did not spend those 48 hours panicking. She did not spend them crying or praying or writing desperate letters to relatives who might help. She spent them the way she spent most difficult things: working, moving, keeping her hands busy so her mind could sort through what needed sorting without the interference of emotion getting in the way before she was ready for it. She repaired the north fence. She checked on the cattle in the lower pasture. She negotiated via a very pointed written exchange with the feed merchant in town a better rate on summer grain that she was fairly certain he had been overcharging her on for 6 months. She did all of this methodically and calmly, and with the surface composure of a woman who had nothing particular on her mind. And underneath all of it, she thought about Thomas. Not the Thomas she had buried. Not the Thomas of the last year of their marriage, when things had been strained in ways she had not fully understood at the time, when he had been distracted and worried and prone to late nights at his desk with ledgers that he always closed when she came in. She thought about the Thomas she had married at 22, the one who had told her the week before the wedding that he intended to spend his life doing things worth doing. Worth doing. She had asked him what he meant. He had looked at her with those steady brown eyes and said, "Things that matter, Abby. Not just profitable things. Things that are actually right." She had loved him enormously for that. She had also, in the years since his death, quietly revised that memory. The way grief revises things, softening edges, smoothing over the places where the reality hadn't quite matched the ideal. She had let herself believe that the Thomas she buried was the same Thomas she had married, that his values had remained intact all the way to the end. What Caleb had told her suggested that maybe they had. Maybe the distracted, worried, late-night ledger Thomas had not been hiding failure from her. Maybe he had been trying to do something worth doing, She was down at the creek at the eastern edge of the property, checking the banks after a recent rain, when she let herself feel it. Really feel it. The possibility that Thomas had spent the last months of his life trying to expose a man like Langley. The possibility that Langley had known. The possibility that the frozen creek, the broken ice, the accident that everyone in Willow Creek had filed away as a terrible piece of bad luck. The possibility that it wasn't. She stood at the edge of the water and she let herself be furious. Not sad, not frightened. Furious. Because if it was true, and she couldn't prove it. Not yet. Not with what Caleb had brought her. Then everything she had endured for 2 years had a different shape. The struggle to keep the ranch. The snide neighbors, the men who thought a widow was an opportunity. The grinding daily cost of simply refusing to give up all of it had been in part Victor Langley's fault. His calculation. His expectation that if he removed Thomas, the land would eventually find its way to him through attrition, through a widow's inevitable defeat. She had spent 2 years refusing to be defeated without even knowing who she was refusing. She walked back to the house, sat down at Thomas's old desk, and started going through every paper in it for the second time. She had done this once before, right after he died, looking for debts and contracts and anything that would tell her the true shape of what she had inherited. She had been thorough the first time. This time she was looking for something different. It took her 3 hours, but she found it. A letter tucked inside the back cover of an old ledger folded twice and written in Thomas's careful, slightly cramped hand. It was addressed to no one. Dated 3 weeks before he died. It was not a finished document. It read like notes, like a man trying to organize his thoughts before he could decide what to do with them. Names. Dates. Land parcel numbers. A list of families in the territory who had lost property in the last 5 years under circumstances Thomas found suspicious. And at the bottom, underlined twice V. Langley. Helena connection. Who else knows? Abigail read it 4 times. Then she put it in her apron pocket, saddled her horse, and rode 6 miles north to the Three Pines Ranch without sending word ahead. Caleb was splitting wood in the yard when she came through the gate at a pace that told him immediately this was not a social call. He set down his axe and walked toward her before she had fully stopped the horse. "I found something," she said. He read the letter standing in his yard, turning it slightly to catch the afternoon light. When he was done, he looked up at her. He was building a case. He was trying to, Abigail said. He was gathering names, evidence. He hadn't gone to anyone yet. I think he was still trying to figure out who he could trust. And Langley found out before he could. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Caleb folded the letter carefully and held it out to her. "This goes to James Aldrich, tomorrow. I was thinking the same thing. I'll ride with you." She opened her mouth. He could see the reflex, the automatic "I can manage on my own." That was her default response to any offer of assistance, and then visibly she stopped it. "All right," she said. He nodded. "Come inside. There's coffee." "Is it better than mine?" "Considerably." "Then yes," she said, and swung down from the horse. They rode to Bozeman the next morning, leaving before dawn, because Abigail wanted to be there when James Aldrich's office opened, and not a minute later. Caleb rode beside her without much conversation, which she appreciated. She was thinking, and he seemed to understand that, and he let her think. James Aldrich was a lean, deliberate man of about 50, with the kind of face that gave nothing away until it was ready to give something. He read Thomas's letter without expression, and then he looked at Abigail over his spectacles with an attention that was assessing without being unkind. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need a direct answer." "Go ahead," she said. "Do you understand that if we pursue this, not just the land claim, but the full pattern of Langley's conduct, including the questions around your husband's death, this becomes a different kind of fight? Not just a property dispute. Something significantly larger and significantly more dangerous." Abigail met his gaze without flinching. "I understand. Langley has resources. He has attorneys in 3 territories. He has relationships with certain officials that complicate things. He will not receive a legal challenge quietly." "Good," Abigail said. "I don't intend to be quiet either." James studied her for another long moment. Then he set the letter down on his desk, picked up his pen and said, "Then let's begin." What began was not fast. Legal processes were not fast, and James Aldrich, who was thorough in proportion to his deliberateness, was methodical in ways that sometimes made Abigail want to drive to Bozeman and stand in his office demanding he move more quickly, which she sensibly did not do. She understood that the case they were building needed to be solid. Langley would look for every weakness. Any gap, any imprecision, any document that wasn't fully corroborated would become ammunition in his hands. So she waited. And while she waited, she managed her ranch and watched the town and noticed things. The first thing she noticed was that the news had spread. She wasn't sure how, maybe through Langley's attorney, maybe through someone at the council, maybe simply through the relentless information network of a small frontier town. But within 2 weeks of James filing the initial response to Langley's claim, people in Willow Creek knew that Abigail Mercer was fighting back. And people in Willow Creek had opinions about that. Some of those opinions were warm. Hetty Crawford, who ran the dry goods store and had been quietly kind to Abigail since Thomas died, pressed her arm one morning and said in a low voice, "You give that man what he deserves, honey." Old Elias Pruitt, who had ranched in the territory for 30 years and knew every piece of land and every corrupt scheme that had ever touched it, stopped her on the road one afternoon and said, "Langley tried to get my southern pasture 8 years ago. Backed off when I threatened to shoot him, but that ain't an option you've got. You've got the right idea going through the law. Hold fast." But others, and this was the thing that sharpened Abigail's jaw and straightened her spine every time she encountered it, others seemed to find the situation uncomfortable for different reasons. Not because they supported Langley, but because the spectacle of a woman in a formal legal fight was apparently disconcerting in ways they couldn't quite articulate, but couldn't quite let go of either. She was in the general store one afternoon when she overheard Margaret Harcourt, wife of the same Harcourt, whose cowboys had watched her fix her own wagon wheel, telling someone in the next aisle that it was a shame Abigail Mercer didn't have a male relative to handle things for her, because a woman alone in a legal matter like this was going to be eaten alive. Abigail walked around the end of the aisle and said pleasantly, "I expect Victor Langley thought the same thing, Mrs. Harcourt. We'll see how that works out for him." And she went back to her shopping. Caleb heard about it from 3 separate people by the following afternoon, all of them delivering the story with a mixture of delight and faint anxiety, the way people report on someone they admire and are slightly afraid of in equal measure. He was at the Mercer Ranch that evening. It had become something of a routine. By then, those evenings on the porch or in the kitchen, when she was too tired to work but too alert to sleep, and he would bring information, or she would share something she'd found, and they would talk through what it meant when he brought it up. "I heard about the general store," he said. "Did you?" she said. 3 times. "People in this town need more to do." Abigail. He waited until she looked at him. "You understand that Langley's people are also hearing these stories." She looked at him steadily. "I know. He's going to start applying pressure outside the legal process. That's his pattern. James mentioned it when the courts don't move fast enough for him, he looks for other leverage." "What kind of leverage?" "Supply chain interference. Making it hard for you to do business, merchants, refusing credit suppliers, holding back orders. He's done it before to people he was pressuring. Creates financial strain, makes them more likely to settle." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "He'd go after my suppliers," she said. "He'd try." "Let him try," she said. And then, in a voice that was very flat and very certain, "I've been building relationships in this territory for 2 years. Real ones. The kind you build by paying your debts on time and treating people fairly and showing up when you say you will. Langley buys relationships. There's a difference, and it matters." Caleb believed her. He also quietly sent some letters of his own to suppliers he knew in Billings and in Bozeman, establishing informal understandings. Nothing that could be traced or leveraged back, just the kind of quiet network building that was itself a form of protection. He didn't tell Abigail he was doing it because she would have told him not to, not because she didn't want his help. He understood that about her now, but because she had a powerful need to know that what she built was built by her own hand. He respected that completely. He built it alongside her invisibly and said nothing about it. July came, and with it the heat, and with the heat a new development. James Aldrich wrote to tell them he had located 3 families who had lost land to Langley through manufactured debt claims in the last 4 years. One of them, a widow named Cecilia Porter, living in a small town 60 miles east, had kept records. Meticulous, detailed, frightened records that she had never known what to do with, because no attorney had been willing to take the case, and no official had been interested in listening. Cecilia Porter is willing to testify, James's letter said, but she is afraid. She will need support. Abigail read the letter and made a decision without consulting anyone. She rode 60 miles east. She found Cecilia Porter in a 2-room house on the edge of a property that had once been twice its current size. Cecilia was a small woman, perhaps 10 years older than Abigail, with the kind of face that had once been cheerful and was now permanently braced. She opened the door and looked at Abigail and said, "You're the Mercer woman." "Yes," Abigail said. "They said you were fighting Langley." "I am." Cecilia stared at her for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." They talked for 4 hours. Cecilia told her everything. The letter that had arrived out of nowhere, claiming her late husband had borrowed against the land. The legal pressure that had escalated when she challenged it the day she had been told by an official she still couldn't name that she might want to reconsider her stubbornness. She told it all in the flat, careful voice of someone who had rehearsed the telling privately many times without ever having a real audience for it, and Abigail listened to every word with the full total attention she had given James Aldrich that first morning. When Cecilia was finished, Abigail said, "Will you testify?" Cecilia's hands folded on the table tightened. "I'm frightened." "I know," Abigail said. "I'm frightened too." Cecilia looked at her sharply, as if she hadn't expected that. "But I'm doing it anyway," Abigail said. "Because Thomas was trying to do this before he died, and he didn't get the chance. And I think your husband might have been trying to do the same thing. And I think we owe it to both of them." A long silence. "And because," Abigail continued, her voice quieter, but no less certain, "if we don't, he'll keep doing this. To the next woman, and the one after that." Cecilia looked at the window for a long moment. At the land she had kept the smaller version of what she had started with. Then she looked back at Abigail. "All right," she said. "I'll testify." Abigail rode back to Willow Creek that evening in the dark 60 miles home, arriving well past midnight. She was exhausted in a way that went down to the bone. But underneath it was something else, a sense of the thing, getting larger, getting cleaner, taking on a shape that she could actually see now, instead of just believing in theoretically. Caleb was at the gate when she came in, which startled her enough that she pulled up sharply. "What are you doing here?" she said. "You left at dawn and said you'd be back by supper," he said. "It's 2 a.m. I said I might be back by supper." "You said you'd be back by supper, and you were 2 hours away." "Abigail and Langley's people have been in town this week." "I'm fine," she said. "I can see that," he said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, not anger exactly, but something tightly controlled that was sitting right next to it. "I can see you're fine. I've been sitting out here for 6 hours seeing it." She looked at him in the darkness. Something about that. The sheer undramatic matter-of-fact fact of him having waited 6 hours without being asked to, without any expectation of credit for it, without anything other than the simple need to know she was safe, did something to her chest that she was entirely unprepared for. "Caleb," she said. "Don't," he said. "Don't what? Don't apologize. Don't tell me you didn't need anyone to wait. Don't do the thing where you turn this into a conversation about self-sufficiency." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you don't need someone to wait. I waited because I wanted to. Those are different things." She sat on her horse in the dark, and she looked at him for a long moment, and she thought, "I know." She thought, "I know they're different, and I know what it means that you're here, and I don't know what to do with that yet, but I know." "She'll testify," Abigail said finally. "Cecilia Porter, she has records." His posture shifted, not releasing exactly, but reorganizing around this new information. "That changes things. James thinks so too. I'll write to him in the morning." She paused. Thank you. For waiting. Don't mention it, he said. But his voice had changed, gone back to dry steady, the ordinary Caleb voice, and she understood that this was how he managed it, the same way she managed everything, by keeping it in motion, by doing the next thing, by not letting the emotion sit still long enough to become overwhelming. She had been doing that for 2 years. She was beginning to understand that she had been so focused on not letting things sit still that she hadn't let herself ask whether any of them were worth sitting still for. August arrived with a piece of news that none of them had anticipated. One of Langley's own men, a junior associate named Gerald Fitch, who had been handling the day-to-day of the land claim against Abigail, contacted James Aldrich in the second week of August with an offer that was not in technical terms, legal testimony, but was the next thing to it. Fitch had been with Langley for 4 years. He had processed documents. He had witnessed conversations. He had, it became clear when James met with him, developed a conscience that was currently being expressed as an urgent desire to be somewhere other than Victor Langley's direct line of fire when the whole thing came down. He wants protection, James wrote to Abigail and Caleb. He's negotiating terms. If we can offer assurances about his own legal exposure being limited, he will provide documentation that directly contradicts the claims Langley has made against your property, and will speak to a pattern of manufactured debt schemes going back 7 years. Abigail read the letter 3 times. Then she sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. He's going to lose, she said quietly. To the kitchen. To no one in particular. Caleb, who was sitting across the table with his own copy of the letter, looked up. James still needs time to formalize everything, and Langley's going to find out about Fitch. These things leak. When he does, he'll move fast. What does that mean, move fast? It means the pressure that's been indirect might become direct. Caleb set the letter down. I need to tell you something I should have told you sooner. Something in his tone made her go still. Tell me. 2 weeks ago, someone came through town asking questions about you, about the ranch, about the property layout, where the fences were, whether you had staff who stayed overnight. He paused. It wasn't a Langley attorney. It was someone with a different kind of interest in that information. The silence in the kitchen was very specific. You're saying he's considering something other than legal pressure, Abigail said. I'm saying I don't know. I'm saying I'm not willing to assume he isn't. She absorbed that. And you waited 2 weeks to tell me. I was verifying. I wanted to be sure I wasn't alarming you without cause. Caleb. Her voice was very careful. Do not make decisions about what I should or shouldn't know. He met her eyes. You're right. I'm sorry. That's the last time. She accepted the apology with a single nod, the way she accepted most things, completely and without further discussion. So what do we do? She said. James files everything he has in the next week before Langley can consolidate. Cecilia Porter's testimony, Fitch's documentation, Thomas's letter, all of it simultaneously, so Langley can't suppress any piece of it before it's on record. Caleb kept his voice even. And in the meantime, you don't stay at the ranch alone at night. She opened her mouth. As a neighbor, he said, I have a completely impersonal concern for the safety of neighboring properties that might be targeted by a man we are actively working to legally destroy. The corner of her mouth moved. Completely impersonal, she said. Entirely, he confirmed. She looked at him for a long moment, that gray-green gaze, that ledger-reading precision that never missed anything. And something in it shifted just slightly, the way it had been shifting in small increments since the evening in the barn, when he had told her what he suspected about Thomas. Not toward anything either of them had named, but toward something. I'm going to write to James tonight, she said. I know. And in the morning, I'm going to go into town and talk to Elias Pruitt, because he knows every piece of land Langley has ever touched in this territory. And I want to know if there's anything James doesn't have yet. Good idea. And then, she said, I am going to stand in front of the town council and tell them exactly what Victor Langley has been doing in this territory for the last 7 years. Because even if the courts handle it correctly, I want every person in this valley to know his name and what it means. Caleb was quiet for a moment. The council won't all be on your side, he said. I know. Langley has friends on it. I know that too, Abigail said. But their friends have families, and their families have neighbors. And by the time I'm done, every person in Willow Creek is going to know exactly what kind of man they've been allowing to do business in their territory. She paused. Thomas was trying to stop this. He didn't get to finish. I will. It was the most she had said about Thomas in a single breath since all of this had started. And there was something in how she said it, the way his name sat in the sentence, not as grief, but as purpose, not as an ending, but as a reason that told Caleb something had changed in how she was carrying it. Not lighter, not less, but differently. She was no longer carrying Thomas's death. She was carrying Thomas's intention. He stood up from the table, picked up his hat. I'll be back tomorrow morning. You don't have to. As a neighbor, he said, heading for the door. She said very quietly to his back, Caleb. He stopped. I know it isn't only that, she said. I know it hasn't been only that for a while. He didn't turn around. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the evening dark, and she could see the set of his shoulders, the carefully controlled stillness of a man who was deciding something. No, he said, it hasn't. He walked out into the dark. She sat at Thomas's desk for a long time after he left the letter from James, open in front of her, and the lamp burning low, and she thought about all the walls she had built carefully, deliberately post by post, just like the fences she had repaired with her own hands, and she thought about what they had cost her and what they had protected her from, and whether those two things were actually the same. She did not have an answer, but for the first time in 2 years, she found herself wondering if she wanted one. Outside, the Montana night was dark and enormous, and completely indifferent to the small human dramas playing out under its stars. Somewhere to the east, Cecilia Porter was sleeping in a 2-room house on a reduced piece of land, having made the decision to stop being afraid. Somewhere in Helena, Victor Langley was beginning to understand that the widow he had assumed would fold quietly was instead building something he had not anticipated, and somewhere between those two realities, Abigail Mercer was sitting at her dead husband's desk, holding a letter that might be the beginning of the end of a 7-year scheme, built on the assumption that certain people could be counted on to give up. She had never been good at giving up. She was starting to wonder if she had been too good at it in other ways, at giving up on things she was afraid to want, at protecting herself so thoroughly from heartbreak that she had also protected herself from everything that made protection worth having. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. And in the morning she got up before dawn, saddled her horse, and went to do what needed doing. Because that was who she was. That had always been who she was. Victor Langley was about to find out exactly what that meant. The letter from James Aldrich arrived on a Thursday morning, and it contained exactly one sentence that mattered above everything else written in it. Victor Langley knows about Gerald Fitch. Abigail read it, standing at the kitchen table, still in her work clothes from the morning feed. And then she read it again, and then she set it down flat on the table and pressed both palms against it, as if she could push the information back into the paper and buy herself another hour before it became real. She couldn't. She picked up her hat, walked out the door, saddled her horse, and rode to 3 Pines without sending word ahead. She had stopped pretending somewhere in the last 3 weeks that these rides north were anything other than what they were. Caleb was in the yard when she arrived, talking with one of his ranch hands, and he took one look at her face and said, "Give us a minute," to the hand who disappeared without argument. "James wrote," Abigail said. "I got the same letter this morning," Caleb said. "Come inside." They stood in his kitchen. Neither of them sat. The situation didn't call for sitting, and Caleb said, "Fitch is spooked. James got word that Langley sent 2 men to Fitch's boarding house in Helena yesterday. Fitch wasn't there, but he knows they came. Will he still testify? James doesn't know yet. He's trying to reach him." Abigail put her hand flat on Caleb's kitchen table, the same way she had put it on her own, and she stared at nothing for a moment, working through it. If Fitch disappears, we still have Cecilia Porter. We still have Thomas's letter. We still have the pattern James has documented from 4 other families. "It's enough to damage Langley," Caleb said. "I don't know if it's enough to stop him completely." "It has to be enough," she said. "We make it enough." He looked at her with that quiet, steady attention that she had come to understand meant he was about to say something she needed to hear, and wasn't sure she was going to like. James wants to file everything next Tuesday, all of it simultaneous, before Langley can apply any more pressure on Fitch or Cecilia or anyone else. Then we make sure everything is ready by Tuesday. There's something else, Caleb said. She looked at him. Langley is coming to Willow Creek. The kitchen went very quiet. When? She said. James's contact in Helena says he left 2 days ago. He'll be here by the weekend. Caleb kept his voice measured, but something underneath it was not measured at all. He comes personally when he's decided that the indirect approach isn't working, when he wants to close something himself. Abigail was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Good." Caleb blinked. "Good. Yes," she said. "I want to look at him. I want to be in the same room with the man who—" She stopped. Started again. "I want him to see my face. I want him to understand that I am not afraid of him, and I want to see in his eyes when he realizes that it's too late, that we've already built something he can't tear down." Caleb studied her for a long moment. "You're going to confront him. I'm going to let him try to intimidate me," she said. "And then I'm going to show him what 2 years of surviving looks like up close." He was quiet. Then he said, "I'll be there." Caleb. "As a neighbor," he said. Flat. Leaving no room. Completely impersonal interest in community affairs. Despite everything. Despite the cold knot of anxiety sitting in her chest, and the very real possibility that everything they had built was about to be tested in ways she couldn't fully anticipate. Something in Abigail's chest loosened just slightly around the edges. "All right," she said. Victor Langley arrived in Willow Creek on a Saturday afternoon in the middle of August, and he arrived the way men like him always arrived, with purpose and with performance. He came in a private coach, not a wagon, a coach lacquered black and pulled by matched horses that cost more than most families in Willow Creek earned in a year. He took rooms at the best hotel in town, which was not a particularly impressive hotel, but became by virtue of his occupying it a statement. He had 2 men with him who were not attorneys. Abigail knew he had arrived because Hetty Crawford came to her ranch that same afternoon, slightly out of breath, with the look of a woman delivering urgent intelligence. "He's here," Hetty said. "Big as life, walking down the main street like he owns it." She paused. "Like he's planning to." "Thank you, Hetty," Abigail said. "What are you going to do?" "The same thing I've been doing," Abigail said. "What needs doing?" She did not go into town that afternoon. She worked the ranch, finished what needed finishing, ate supper, and went to bed at her normal hour, and slept not perfectly, but enough. She had learned in the last 2 years that exhaustion was a weapon her enemies could use against her, and she could not afford to hand it to them. In the morning she dressed carefully. Not her work clothes. Her better clothes, the dark blue dress she wore for business, the one that said, "I am a serious person conducting serious affairs," without saying anything out loud. She did her hair with more care than usual. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her wash basin for a moment, long enough to remind herself who she was, and then she went downstairs and found Caleb sitting at her kitchen table with coffee. She stopped in the doorway. "I let myself in," he said. "The door was unlocked." "I know it was." "You look like you're going to war," he said. "I am going to war," she said. "Is the coffee better than mine?" "Considerably." She poured herself a cup and sat across from him. "Has James filed yet?" "Courier left Bozeman at first light this morning. Everything goes to the territorial court by noon." He met her eyes. "By the time Langley sits down across from you, it will already be done." Something in her released, just slightly. "Good." "Abigail." Caleb set down his cup. "I need you to understand something about today." "Tell me." "Langley is going to try to make you angry. That's his method in person. He provokes, he gets under your skin, he makes you say something or do something that he can use. He is very good at it." "I know." "He's going to say things about Thomas." She went still. "He's going to suggest things about your marriage, about Thomas's competence, about whether you actually understood what your husband was involved in. He will use Thomas as a tool to destabilize you." Caleb's voice was absolutely level. I'm telling you now, so it isn't a surprise when it happens." Abigail absorbed that. Set it in its proper place the way she set everything clearly, deliberately, where it could be seen and accounted for. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me. You're not going to let it work." "No," she said. "I'm not." He nodded, picked up his coffee again. "Then let's go." Langley had requested a meeting. The request had come through his attorney to James, who had relayed it to Abigail with a note that said she was because she thought the same thing, and also because she wanted to look at him. They met in a private room at the hotel, arranged by the attorney, with the studied neutrality of a man who was beginning to suspect he was on the wrong side of something, but hadn't yet decided what to do about that. Langley was already in the room when Abigail arrived with Caleb. He stood when she entered, which was either courtesy or calculation. With a man like Langley, she suspected everything was calculation. How was older than she had imagined. Perhaps 60 heavy through the shoulders with a wide, well-fed face and small eyes that moved quickly and missed nothing. He dressed well. He had the manner of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he had entered for so long that he no longer questioned it. He looked at her, the way men like him always looked at women like her, with a surface respect that was entirely performance, and underneath it, a complete, thorough assessment of what she was worth and how much resistance she was likely to offer. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "thank you for coming." "Mr. Langley," she said. She sat down without being invited to. He looked at Caleb. "Caleb Whitmore," Caleb said pleasantly. "Neighboring rancher, completely informal capacity." Langley's small eyes moved back to Abigail. He sat down. His attorney sat beside him and opened a leather case. "I had hoped," Langley said, in the smooth, reasonable voice of a man who had spent decades making unreasonable things sound sensible, "that we might resolve this matter without further legal expense to either party." "I'm sure you did," Abigail said. "The claim against your property is straightforward. Your husband entered into an agreement." "My husband entered into no agreement with you," Abigail said. "We both know that. Let's not use this room to rehearse things neither of us believes." A pause. Just half a second. But she saw at the small recalibration behind his eyes the adjustment of his approach. She had not responded the way he expected. "Good. Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice staying smooth. "I understand this has been a difficult time. Losing your husband, managing the property alone. These are not small burdens. I have no wish to add to them." "Then withdraw the claim," she said. "That's not something I'm in a position to do. The agreement." "There is no agreement," she said. "You know it. Your attorney knows it. And as of approximately 2 hours ago, the territorial court in Bozeman knows it, along with a substantial amount of additional information about your business practices over the last 7 years." She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. "So I'll ask you again, and this will be the last time I ask, pleasantly withdraw the claim." The temperature in the room changed. Langley's attorney stopped writing. Langley himself went very still, and in the stillness, she saw the thing underneath the polished surface. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more deliberate. The look of a man recalculating. "You've been talking to James Aldrich," Langley said. "I have," she agreed. "Aldrich is a nuisance. He has never successfully brought a case. He has 4 families' testimony," Abigail said. "He has documentation from Gerald Fitch. He has a letter written in my husband's hand, naming you specifically dated 3 weeks before Thomas died." She paused. "And he has me." The room was absolutely silent. Then Langley did exactly what Caleb had warned her he would do. His expression shifted not dramatically, just at the edges, a slight softening that was meant to look like sympathy, and was actually a weapon being loaded. "Your husband," he said carefully, "was a man with significant debts he chose not to share with you. I don't say that to cause pain. I say it because I think you may not fully understand the situation you inherited." There it was. She felt it, the intended point of entry, the place where a different woman might have flinched, might have felt doubt, might have wondered for just a moment whether the story she believed about Thomas was the true one. She felt it, and she recognized it, and she did not flinch. "My husband," Abigail said, "was a man who spent the last weeks of his life documenting your crimes. He named you. He named the properties. He named the families. Her voice stayed completely even. He didn't finish. I finished it for him. So whatever you intended to accomplish by coming here, Mr. Langley, you are too late. Langley looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. And his eyes, when they landed on Caleb, were no longer smooth. Whitmore, he said. You've involved yourself in something that has nothing to do with you. Neighboring property owner, Caleb said. I have a general community interest in land rights being respected. Very impersonal. You should be more careful, Langley said, about where you put your interests. The room had shifted again. No longer negotiation. Something that was just barely a threat dressed in a business suit. Caleb looked at Langley with an expression of such complete, unhurried calm that it was itself a statement. I'll keep that in mind, he said. Abigail stood up. Both men looked at her. We're finished here, she said. Your attorney will receive the formal documentation from James Aldrich by end of day. I'd suggest you spend the time between now and when this reaches the court, deciding how cooperative you want to be, because the difference between those two options is significant. She picked up her gloves from the table. Good day, Mr. Langley. She walked out of that room without looking back, and Caleb followed her, and neither of them spoke until they were out of the hotel and on the street. And then Abigail stopped walking and stood very still for a moment and breathed. You all right? Caleb said. He killed Thomas, she said, quietly. Not a question. She said it the way you say something that you have suspected for a long time and have now had confirmed not by evidence, but by looking into someone's eyes and recognizing what was looking back. I know we can't prove it. I know what we have isn't proof of that specifically, but I looked at him and I know. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I know too, he said. She nodded once, set her jaw. Then we prove everything else so thoroughly that it doesn't matter what we can't prove about that. We take everything else away from him, all of it. That's the plan, he said. Good, she said. Then let's go make sure James has everything he needs. What neither of them knew, walking away from that hotel in the August heat, was that the meeting had already had a consequence neither of them had anticipated. Gerald Fitch had not disappeared. He had been in Willow Creek. James Aldrich, who had more operational subtlety than his deliberate manner suggested, had brought Fitch not to Helena, not to Bozeman, but to Willow Creek itself, tucked quietly into a room above Hetty Crawford's dry goods store of all places, because Hetty Crawford had taken one look at the situation 2 weeks earlier and said with the practicality of a woman who had survived 40 years on the frontier, You need somewhere to put someone safe. You put them here. Nobody looks for anything important above a dry goods store. Fitch had been there for 4 days. He had been there when Langley's coach came through town, and he had watched from the window above the store, and something about seeing Langley in person in the flesh, the man who had employed him and whom he had worked for and had quietly feared for. 4 years. Something about seeing him had done something to Gerald Fitch's resolve. James told them about it that afternoon in Hetty's back room, with Fitch himself sitting at the table looking like a man who had made a decision and was both relieved and terrified by it. Fitch was perhaps 40 unremarkable looking, with the manner of a man who had spent years making himself unnoticeable as a professional strategy. He looked at Abigail when she came in with the focus of someone who had heard a great deal about her and was checking the reality against the description. Mrs. Mercer, he said. Mr. Fitch, she said, and sat across from him. James tells me you have something to add to what we've already filed. I do, he said. He put his hands flat on the table, steadying himself. She recognized the gesture. I have documents, Langley's own records, not copies originals or photographs of originals, the kind that show exactly how the debt claims were manufactured. Names, dates, the specific language he used to make the forgeries look legitimate. He paused. And one more thing. James leaned forward slightly. There was a meeting, Fitch said. About 18 months before Thomas Mercer died. Langley met with someone I don't know the name. I was never told about a rancher in Willow Creek who was asking questions about the eastern land purchases. Questions that were getting too close. Abigail did not move. What kind of meeting? Caleb said. The kind, Fitch said carefully, where the solution being discussed was not legal. The room held its breath. Abigail said very quietly, "Say plainly what you mean." Fitch looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she recognized: the specific guilt of a person who had known something terrible and done nothing about it, and had been carrying that weight ever since. "I mean," he said, "that Thomas Mercer's accident may not have been an accident. And I mean that I can testify to the meeting in which the alternative was discussed, even if I cannot give you a name." He stopped. "I should have come forward sooner. I know that. I was afraid." "You're here now," Abigail said. Her voice was steady. Remarkable to her in the moment how steady it was, as if she had been bracing for this exact confirmation for so long, that when it arrived, it didn't shatter anything, only settled into the place she had already prepared for it. "I'm here now," Fitch agreed. She looked at James. "Does this change the filing?" "We can submit a supplemental affidavit," James said. "It won't be part of the civil case directly, but it creates a record. It opens a door for other authorities to walk through." He paused. "This could become criminal, Abigail, not just property law." "I know," she said. "Are you prepared for that?" She thought about Thomas at his desk late at night closing his ledger when she came in. She thought about the frozen creek in February. She thought about 2 years of fighting to keep land she had been allowed to keep only because Langley had expected her to fail on her own. "I've been prepared for it," she said, "since the day I found his letter." The next 4 days were the most intense of the entire ordeal. More intense even than the original legal threat, because now the shape of the thing had changed. What had begun as a property dispute was becoming something that reached into the past and touched the most painful part of Abigail's history, and doing it in public in formal legal proceedings with all of Willow Creek watching. Langley's response to the supplemental filing was swift and aggressive. His attorneys filed challenges on 3 separate procedural grounds. He sent representatives to speak with members of the town council, and 2 of those council members, men who had it, became clear received favors from Langley. At some point began making noise about the process, about jurisdictional questions about whether James Aldrich had overstepped. Abigail went to speak with those council members herself. She did not take Caleb. She did not take James. She went alone because this was exactly the kind of thing that needed to be done without a man beside her, and she had known it from the moment she heard which members were being difficult. She went to see Harold Finch first. He was the older of the 2, a man in his 60s, who had been on the council for 15 years and had the comfortable authority of someone who had never had his decisions seriously questioned. She knocked on his door at 7 in the morning, which was an intentional choice, and when he opened it in his shirt sleeves with a look of profound surprise, she said, "Good morning, Harold. I need 10 minutes." He let her in because refusing would have required more composure than the situation had given him time to gather. She sat in his kitchen, and she told him plainly, and without theatrics, what she knew about his relationship with Victor Langley. She did not threaten him. She did not need to. The information itself was the entire conversation, and Harold Finch was underneath the comfortable authority, a man who valued his reputation in the community more than he valued whatever Langley had given him. When she was done, she said, "I'm not asking you to testify. I'm not asking you to publicly disavow anything. I'm asking you to stand aside and let the process run without interference." Harold Finch looked at his kitchen table for a long moment. "You're a hard woman, Abigail Mercer," he said. "No," she said. "I'm a clear one. There's a difference." He said nothing after that. But when the council met 2 days later, Harold Finch did not raise any of the concerns Langley's representatives had prepared for him. The second council member was younger and more frightened, and took the same conversation significantly worse. There were raised voices and a threat that Abigail would regret interfering in things she didn't understand, and a moment where he stood up from his chair in a way that was meant to be physically intimidating. Abigail did not stand up. She stayed seated, which itself took a particular kind of nerve, and she looked up at him and said with complete calm, "Sit down, Edward. You're frightened, and you're making poor decisions. Sit down, and we'll finish this conversation like adults." He sat down. She finished the conversation. She told Caleb about both meetings that evening in her kitchen, with the matter-of-fact tone of a woman reporting on completed tasks. When she got to the part about Edward standing up, Caleb's jaw tightened. She saw it. "I handled it," she said. I know you did. I don't need— I know, he said. I know you don't need me to handle things for you. I just— He stopped. His voice had something in it she had learned by now to recognize as the controlled version of something much less controlled. I just don't love the idea of you in a room alone with a frightened man who's also angry. She looked at him for a moment. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in a week, she said. He met her eyes. I'm trying. I know, she said quietly. And she meant it in more ways than one. The council meeting was on a Friday. James filed the full case on Wednesday. Langley's challenges were denied one by one with a speed that suggested the territorial court had been waiting for exactly this kind of case, with exactly this kind of evidence. Cecilia Porter arrived in Willow Creek on Thursday evening, accompanied by a young woman who turned out to be her daughter, and Abigail met her at the stage and brought her to Hetty Crawford's spare room, where Fitch was still staying, and the three of them, two widows and a frightened man with a conscience, sat around a small table and went over everything one final time. Cecilia was calmer than Abigail had seen her. Still frightened, the fear was still in her hands, which she kept folded tight in her lap, but underneath the fear was something new, purpose. My husband tried to fight him too, Cecilia said at one point. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, more like something she was setting down after carrying it a long time. I know, Abigail said. He didn't know how. Cecilia looked at her. How did you? Abigail thought about it honestly. I had help, she said, and I was angry enough to not let the fear be louder. Cecilia nodded slowly. Yes, she said. That's it exactly. On Friday morning, the day of the council meeting, something happened that nobody had anticipated. A rider came from Helena with a letter from the Territorial Marshal's office. James read it first. Then he handed it to Abigail without a word, because his expression had gone to the particular stillness of a man processing very significant news. The Marshal's office had received a communication from Victor Langley's own attorney, not the attorney who had been handling the land claims, but a different attorney, a senior one from a firm in Helena, indicating that Langley was prepared to cooperate with the broader investigation in exchange for certain considerations regarding the scope of criminal charges. He was negotiating. He was protecting himself. How was in the language of men who built empires on the assumption that others would break before they did, blinking first. Abigail read the letter twice. She handed it back to James. He's going to try to control the collapse, she said. Make sure he gets to choose which parts come out and which parts he can keep buried. Yes, James said. Can he? He can try. Whether he succeeds depends on what the Marshal's office decides to prioritize. James looked at her carefully. There may be things he is able to keep quiet, things we can't force into the open, even with everything we have. She knew what he was saying without him saying it. There might never be a formal legal finding about Thomas. The meeting Fitch had witnessed might remain forever in the category of things that were known without being proven, believed without being actionable. She sat with that for a long moment. It was Caleb who said what she needed to hear, and he said it quietly, sitting beside her in James's borrowed office, with the morning light coming through the window. It doesn't change what Thomas did, he said. He still spent the last weeks of his life trying to stop this man. That still happened. That's still true. She looked at him. And it doesn't change what you did, he continued. You finished what he started. Whatever Langley gets to keep quiet, he is finished in this territory. The families he stole from have their records. Cecilia Porter has her testimony on file. Fitch's documents are in the court record. The shape of what he's done is public and permanent now. Caleb's voice was steady and sure. You did that. You. Abigail looked at him for a long time. She had spent 2 years building walls post by post, telling herself it was strength. And it had been strength for a while. It had been what she needed to survive. But somewhere between that Wednesday morning with the broken wagon wheel and this Friday morning with a letter that said, Victor Langley was blinking somewhere in all of that, the walls had started to feel less like protection and more like a habit she hadn't examined in too long. Caleb, she said. Abigail, after today, she said, carefully. After all of this is finished, I need to talk to you about something. His expression did not change dramatically. but something in it did some small specific shift that she had learned to read by now with the same precision she brought to reading ledgers and weather and cattle. It was the look of a man who had been very patient and very careful for a very long time and was doing a particular kind of breathing. "All right," he said. "After today," she said. "I'll be here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded once. She stood up. She put on her hat. She straightened her shoulders the way she always did when she was about to walk into something that required everything she had. "Then let's go finish this," she said, and they walked out into the August morning, into Willow Creek, into the day that would settle the shape of everything past and present. And though she didn't say it yet, the future, she was slowly, carefully, one deliberate decision at a time, beginning to allow herself to want. The town council meeting was supposed to start at 10 o'clock in the morning. At 9:55. Abigail was standing outside the council hall with James Aldrich on one side and Caleb on the other, and every person in Willow Creek who had nothing else to do on a Friday morning, which turned out to be a significant number of people, was either inside already or crowded near the entrance, trying to get in. Hetty Crawford had saved seats near the front for Cecilia Porter and her daughter. Old Elias Pruitt was there, hat in hand, standing against the back wall, with the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time to see something like this happen. Abigail looked at all of it and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt calm. Not the performed calm of the last 2 years. The deliberate, constructed stillness she put on every morning like armor. Real calm. The kind that comes when you have done everything that can be done, and now it is simply time to stand in the room and let the thing be what it is. "You ready?" James said. "Yes," she said, and she walked in. The hall was full. Every seat was taken. The 5 council members sat at the long table at the front. Harold Finch, among them, face, carefully neutral eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. Edward Marsh, the younger one she had visited, was beside him, looking like a man who had not slept well. Langley's senior attorney was there. Not the local man who had been handling the property claim, but the Helena attorney, the senior one. The one whose letter to the marshal's office had told them that Langley was already trying to negotiate the shape of his own collapse. He sat at a table to the left with 2 associates and a leather case full of documents that Abigail suspected were mostly theater at this point. Abigail sat at the table to the right, James beside her, Caleb directly behind her, which she could feel without looking, the specific presence of him, steady and unhurried like a fence post set deep and true. The council chairman, a man named Walter Greer, who had the look of someone who had badly underestimated how complicated this morning was going to be, called the meeting to order and began the procedural formalities that all such meetings required, and Abigail sat through them with her hands folded on the table and her expression completely professionally composed. Langley's attorney went first. His name was Sullivan, and he was very good at his job, which Abigail had known going in and had factored into her expectations accordingly. He spoke for 20 minutes in the measured, authoritative tone of a man who had spent a career making complicated situations sound simple and unfavorable positions sound reasonable. He challenged the basis of James's filing. He questioned the credibility of Gerald Fitch, whom he characterized as a disgruntled former employee with personal motivations for fabrication. He suggested that Cecilia Porter's testimony was emotional rather than evidentiary. He referenced Thomas Mercer's alleged debt with the confidence of someone who believed that saying a thing often enough and firmly enough made it true. How was very smooth. Abigail listened to every word and noted every place where the smoothness was covering something. Every assertion that rested on nothing more solid than his own authority. Every moment where he moved quickly past a detail that didn't serve him. When he finished, James stood up. James Aldrich was not smooth. He was deliberate and specific and devastating. He laid out the case the way he had assembled it, methodically, piece by piece, with documentation for each claim, with testimony already on record, with the letter in Thomas's handwriting that he read aloud in full, in a room so quiet that the sound of people breathing was audible. He walked through the 4 families. He walked through Gerald Fitch's documentation. He presented Cecilia Porter's affidavit. He did all of it without theatrics, without raising his voice, without a single word that wasn't anchored to something real. It took 45 minutes. When he finished, Walter Greer looked considerably older than he had at the start of the meeting. "Mrs. Mercer," Greer said, "the council is prepared to hear from you directly if you wish to speak." She had not been sure until that moment whether she was going to. She stood up. The room shifted a collective adjustment the way rooms do when the person everyone has actually been waiting for finally speaks. She did not have notes. She had thought about whether to write things down and decided against it because what she was going to say didn't come from notes. It came from 2 years of getting up before dawn and going to bed after dark and making herself with nothing but her own will and her own 2 hands into someone who could stand in this room on this morning and speak without her voice shaking. "My husband died in February 2 years ago," she said. "And for 2 years I have been told in various ways, sometimes gently, sometimes less, so that the correct response to that was to reduce myself, to sell, to accept help that came with conditions, to become smaller than what I was because a smaller version of me would be easier for a lot of people to manage." She paused. The room was absolutely still. "I didn't do that," she said. "I want to be clear that I understand why people expected me to. I was one woman alone on a struggling piece of land with no male relative to speak for me and no fortune to back me up. By every reasonable calculation, I should have been easy to defeat." She looked at Sullivan Langley's attorney with the precise, even gaze of a woman who had nothing left to be afraid of. "Victor Langley made that calculation. He made it the day my husband died, and possibly before, and he has been waiting patiently, confidently, with the certainty of a man who has done this many times and never been wrong for me to fail." Another pause. She let it sit. "I want to tell this council what I found in my husband's desk 3 weeks ago. Not because you haven't heard it already, James has read it into the record, but because I want you to understand what it means." Her voice stayed steady. "My husband was trying to stop Victor Langley. He was gathering evidence. He was building the same case that James Aldrich has now brought before you, and he was doing it alone without resources, without legal training, because he believed, as I believe, that what Langley has done to the families of this territory is wrong. And Thomas Mercer died before he could finish." She stopped. In the front row, Cecilia Porter had her hands pressed together in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "I finished it for him," Abigail said. "And I am asking this council and the court and the marshal's office and every person in this room who has a family and a piece of land and a future they are trying to protect to look clearly at what has been placed before you today and to do what the law requires." She looked at Greer. "Because the law was built for exactly this. Not for the people who are already powerful. For the people who are simply trying to hold on to what is theirs." She sat down. The room broke open. Not loudly, not the way dramatic rooms do in stories, but in the specific way of a real place full of real people who have just heard something they needed to hear, a kind of collective exhale, a shifting, a resettling. People were speaking to each other in low voices. Council members were leaning together. Sullivan was writing rapidly, and his associates were exchanging looks that said the morning had not gone the way they had prepared for. Caleb's hand came down on her shoulder for one brief moment. Just that, just the weight of it certain and steady. She reached up and put her hand over his for exactly 2 seconds. Then she took her hand back and waited for Walter Greer to restore order, which he did, and the proceedings continued. And by 2 o'clock that afternoon, the Willow Creek Town Council had voted unanimously, Harold Finch included, face still carefully neutral, to formally refer the matter of Victor Langley's land claims to the territorial court for full adjudication, and to forward the supplemental material regarding Thomas Mercer's death to the marshal's office for separate investigation. It was not a verdict. It was not a conviction. It was not in any final sense justice. Justice was slower and more complicated and less satisfying than stories usually admitted. But it was the door opening. It was the lock turning. It was the thing that could not now be undone. Langley left Willow Creek that same afternoon. No dramatic exit, no public statement. Just the black coach rolling back out of town with the same matched horses and the specific silence of a powerful man who has understood for the first time that he is going to be held accountable for what he has done. Abigail watched the coach go from the council hall steps, and she felt something complicated move through her. Not triumph exactly. not the clean satisfaction of the stories she had read in her youth, where justice arrived fully formed, and everyone knew immediately that things had been set right. More like the specific, exhausted relief of having done something true, even knowing the work wasn't finished. Even knowing that the courts would move slowly, and Langley's attorneys would make it difficult, and there would be months, possibly years of further proceedings before anything was finally settled. She had told the truth in a room full of people who needed to hear it. Thomas had tried to do the same thing. She felt standing on those steps connected to him in a way she hadn't felt since he died, not in grief, but in purpose. Like they had, across the impossible distance of his absence, managed to finish something together. Abigail. It was Cecilia Porter coming down the steps beside her, her daughter at her shoulder. Cecilia's eyes were bright in a way they hadn't been when Abigail first went to find her in that two-room house 60 miles east. "Thank you," she said, and then because apparently that wasn't sufficient. "My husband's name was Robert. He would have wanted to know that someone finished this." Abigail took both of Cecilia's hands in hers. "Robert knew," she said. "And Thomas knew. I have to believe that." Cecilia squeezed her hands once hard, and then let go, and walked down the steps with her daughter, and Abigail watched them go. Caleb was beside her. She didn't need to look to know it. "You said you needed to talk to me," he said. "After today." "I did say that." "It's after today." She breathed in. Out. The August air was warm, and the town was doing its ordinary business around them, people moving, conversations, happening, horses, tied at posts, the whole unremarkable machinery of a Thursday afternoon that had no idea it had just witnessed something. "Not here," she said. "Come to the ranch this evening." "All right," he said. She spent the rest of the afternoon doing ordinary things, which she did deliberately, and with the specific intention of not allowing herself to rehearse what she was going to say to Caleb, because rehearsing was a way of trying to control something that didn't need controlling. She fed the cattle. She checked the north fence. She made supper badly in her standard reliable fashion, because whatever gifts she had been given, they had pointedly excluded anything involving a stove. He arrived at 6, tied his horse at the post, came up to the porch where she was sitting with a cup of the terrible coffee. He sat down in the other chair. They were quiet for a while. This was one of the things she had come to value most about him, the fact that silence between them was never awkward, never a problem to be solved. Just two people occupying the same space comfortably enough that they didn't need to fill it. "I've been thinking," she said finally, "about why I kept pushing you away." He didn't say anything. "Not just because of Thomas," she said. "I thought it was that. I told myself it was that. But I've been honest with myself this week. There's been a lot of honesty this week, and I don't think that's entirely true." She looked at the hills. "Thomas and I had a good marriage, not a perfect one. There were things he didn't tell me which we both know now, and I've made my peace with why he was trying to protect me, which was misguided, but came from love. But what I felt with Thomas was real. And losing it was—" She paused. "It changed the geography of things. The whole landscape looked different after." "I know," Caleb said. "What I'm afraid of," she said, "is not loving someone again. I've figured that out this week. What I'm afraid of is building something again, and having the landscape change again. Having the whole world rearrange itself into something I don't recognize and having to start over." She looked at him. "I have rebuilt this ranch post by post with my own hands, and I do not know if I have another rebuilding in me." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes." "When Caroline left," he said, and it was the first time she had heard him say the name with the particular tone that meant it still cost him something. "I decided that the problem was that I had needed her, that needing someone was the vulnerability. So I stopped doing it. I got very good at being self-sufficient. I built the 3 Pines into something solid, and I told myself it was enough." "Was it?" she asked. "It was fine," he said. "Fine is not the same as enough." He looked at her. "And then one Wednesday morning, a woman with bloody knuckles looked at me like I was a line item in a ledger, and I realized that fine was a very poor substitute for the thing I had been calling a liability." Abigail looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to rebuild anything," he said. "I'm not asking you to hand me the power to change your landscape. I know you well enough to know that nobody gets that power over you, and I wouldn't take it if you offered it." He paused. "What I'm asking is whether there's room in the life you've built for someone who wants to be in it. Not to change it, not to manage it, not to rescue you from anything, just to be in it alongside you as someone who—" He stopped. Started again. "As someone who thinks you are the most remarkable person he has ever had the privilege of knowing." The porch was quiet. The hills were going gold in the evening light. Abigail was quiet for so long that she felt him begin to brace the slight shift in his posture of a man preparing to be gracious about a difficult answer. "When I was 19, she said, "I told my mother that I intended to marry a man who treated me like a partner and not a project. She thought that was a very strange thing to want." She looked at him. "I still want that specifically. Not someone to need me. Not someone who needs me to need them. A partner." "I know," he said. "I've seen you work." "If I accept what you're asking," she said, "it won't look like what most people in this town think it should look like." "I've noticed that most people in this town are wrong about most things," he said. "So that seems fine." And there it was, the corner of her mouth moving that quick, surprised, almost against herself expression that he had been collecting like a man who has found something rare and understands its value. "Caleb," she said. "Abigail. I'm not finished being whoever I'm becoming," she said. "I said that before, and it's still true." "Good," he said. "Neither am I. That seems like a reasonable thing to do together." She looked at him for a long moment. "Ask me," she said. "What?" "You've been circling it for 3 months," she said. "Ask me what you've been wanting to ask me." He was quiet. And then Caleb Whitmore, who had built a ranch alone and loved once before and lost her and rebuilt himself into someone who didn't need things, and had then met a woman who made all of that careful construction feel. Beside the point, looked at Abigail Mercer on her own porch in the gold August evening and said plainly, "Is there room in your future for me?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "On one condition." "Name it." "We build it as equals," she said. "Not you saving me, not me needing saving. Two people who chose each other specifically clearly and with full knowledge of who the other person actually is." He looked at her. "Full knowledge," he said. "Including the terrible coffee." "Including the terrible coffee," she confirmed. "That is a significant condition," he said. "It is," she agreed. Howe was quiet for a moment. And then he said with the dry, certain, unhurried voice that she had come to understand was how Caleb Whitmore expressed the things he felt most deeply, agreed. They sat on the porch a while longer in the particular quiet of two people who have said something true to each other and are letting it settle, not rushing past it into what comes next, because what came next would come soon enough, and right now the settling was what mattered. At some point, Hetty Crawford sent word that Gerald Fitch had given his final formal statement to the marshal's office and departed for Denver under a new name and an informal arrangement that James had brokered with the particular moral flexibility of a man who understood that sometimes getting the right outcome required accepting imperfect instruments. At some point, Elias Pruitt sent a note written in his crabbed, deliberate hand, saying that he had spoken to 3 other ranchers in the territory who had relevant information about Langley's eastern land purchases and would be contacting James Aldrich directly. And at some point, as the evening settled into full dark and the stars came up over the Montana hills, Abigail said quietly, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me." "When you waited at the gate," she said. "The night I rode to see Cecilia Porter. When I came home at 2 in the morning and you were at the gate." "I remember." "That was the moment," she said. "That was when I knew. I just wasn't ready to say it yet." He looked at her in the dark, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the quiet acknowledgement of someone hearing confirmed what he had suspected, and had been careful not to press. "6 hours is a long time to wait," he said. "You didn't mind?" "No," he said. "I didn't mind at all." She reached over in the dark and put her hand on his, and this time she didn't take it back after 2 seconds. They stayed there on the porch until it was late, and the cattle were settled in the pasture, and the ranch that she had rebuilt post by post. With her own hands was quiet all around her, and for the first time in 2 years, the quiet felt like something other than something she was enduring. It felt like peace. It felt like something she had earned. The next morning she was up before dawn, as she always was, and she was in the barn doing the morning feed when she heard a horse come through the gate. She looked up. Caleb came in with 2 cups of coffee from his own kitchen, considerably better than hers, which they had agreed was simply the truth and not a criticism, and handed her one, and they stood in the barn in the early morning quiet with the comfortable ease of people who have found their way to the right place. "James wrote," Caleb said. "The territorial court has set a date." "When?" 6 weeks. 6 weeks was fast. Faster than she had expected. It meant the case they had built was solid enough that the court wasn't inclined to delay. "Will Langley fight it?" she asked. "His Helena attorney is still negotiating," Caleb said. "James thinks he may choose to settle, rather than have everything heard publicly. The criminal investigation changes the calculus. If he settles." Abigail said, "I want it on record. Everything. Not a quiet arrangement where he pays some fraction of what he owes and walks away with his reputation partially intact. James knows that. I want the families he took from to have it in writing," she said. "Cecilia Porter, the others. Not just Langley backing off from my land, the whole of it." "I know," Caleb said. "That's what James is pushing for." She looked at the cattle, at the barn that she had repaired herself, at the land visible through the open doors, her land, the land that Victor Langley had looked at and seen an opportunity, and had been very badly wrong about in ways he was still in the process of understanding. "Caleb," she said. "When this is settled," she said. "When the court has done what it's going to do, and Langley is finished in this territory, and the families have their documentation, I want to do something." "What?" "I want to help other women," she said. "The way Hetty helped. The way Elias helped. There are women in this territory in the situation I was in 2 years ago, alone working land, they could lose without the legal knowledge or the connections to protect themselves." She looked at him. "There needs to be something, some resource, some network." He looked at her for a moment. "You want to build something else," he said. "I always want to build something else," she said. "That's who I am." And he smiled, really smiled, which was different from his dry, careful expression, which was itself rarer and more valuable than it appeared, and he said, "I know. That's part of why I've been following you around for 3 months, like a man without better sense." She looked at him sideways. "You have considerably better sense than you're letting on." "I have excellent sense," he agreed. "I just choose to deploy it in the service of impractical things, sometimes. Like waiting 6 hours at someone's gate." "Like that," he said. "Yes." She finished her coffee. She set the cup on the fence post. She picked up her work gloves and pulled them on, and looked at the day ahead. The specific, ordinary, irreplaceable day of a woman on her own land, with her cattle and her fences, and the long, wide Montana sky, and the person she had chosen deliberately and clearly to build the rest of her life beside. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "There's work to do," she said. "There always is," he said. She walked out of the barn and into the morning. He followed, and in Willow Creek. As the day came fully alive around them, nobody who saw Abigail Mercer moving through it would have said she looked like a woman who had been saved. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had saved herself, and chosen someone freely and on her own terms to walk forward with, which was an entirely different thing, an entirely better thing, and the most important distinction she had ever made. 6 weeks later, Victor Langley settled, not quietly, not on his terms, not in the neat, controlled way he had arranged every other settlement in his career, the kind where the money changed hands and the paperwork was sealed, and the people who had been wronged were left with just enough to keep them silent and not quite enough to feel whole. He settled on James Aldrich's terms, on Abigail's terms, on the terms of 4 families whose land he had taken, and a widow named Cecilia Porter, who had kept records in a 2-room house for 3 years because she hadn't known what else to do with the truth. James sent word on a Tuesday morning, and Abigail was at the north fence when Caleb rode out to find her, and he came at a pace that told her before he said a word that something had broken loose. "It's done," he said. She stopped, set down the fencing tool in her hand, looked at him. "All of it," she said. "All of it. The land claims against every family he manufactured, debt against voided. Full documentation entered into the territorial court record. Cecilia Porter gets back the 40 acres. The others get restitution." Caleb swung down from his horse and stood in front of her. "And the marshal's office is proceeding with a criminal investigation. Langley's attorneys couldn't stop it. The cooperation he negotiated limited his exposure on some things, not on others." "Thomas," she said. "The investigation is open," Caleb said carefully. "James says it may not produce a formal finding. The evidence of what happened to Thomas is circumstantial, strong enough to know not sufficient to convict. But it is on record. The meeting Fitch witnessed is on record. The pattern is on record." He looked at her steadily. "It will follow Langley. Every court, every business dealing, every state he tries to operate in. His name is attached to it permanently." Abigail stood at the north fence of her property, the fence she had rebuilt post by post with her own hands. In the first winter after Thomas died, when her hands were so cracked from the cold that they bled onto the wood, and she felt the weight of 2 years shift on her shoulders. Not disappear. She understood enough about grief and truth and unfinished justice to know it didn't disappear. But it redistributed itself into something she could carry differently. Something that didn't press down constantly on the same single point. She picked up her fencing tool. "I need to finish this section," she said. Caleb blinked. "You just found out that—" "I know what I just found out," she said. "And I need a few minutes with it before I know how to talk about it. The best thing I know to do with a few minutes is work." She looked at him. "You could help." He was quiet for a moment. Then he tied his horse to a post and picked up the spare tool from the ground and got to work beside her. They finished the section in 40 minutes without speaking, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had been working alongside each other long enough to anticipate the other's next move. And in those 40 minutes, Abigail let herself feel it, all of it, the whole complicated, layered truth of it. The satisfaction that was also grief. The justice that was also insufficient. The ending that was also not quite an ending, because some endings never arrived in the form you needed them to. Thomas had died trying to do something worth doing. She had finished it. Those two things were both true at the same time, and they would always be both true at the same time, and that was not a tragedy. That was the specific, complicated way that love and loss and purpose move through a life if you were paying attention. She set down the tool. "All right," she said. "Now I know how to talk about it." Caleb looked at her. "I'm glad," she said. "I'm glad it's done. I'm glad the families have their land back. I'm glad Langley's name is attached to this permanently." She stopped. "And I'm sad that it doesn't change the February morning 2 years ago. That Thomas doesn't get to know this happened. That he doesn't get to see that someone finished what he started." Her voice stayed even. "But I think he knew when he was building that case alone at his desk that it was the right thing to do. And I think that was enough for him. It was who he was." Caleb was quiet. "It is who you are too," he said. "That's not a coincidence." She looked at him. "I chose him," she said. "Deliberately, with full knowledge. We recognized something in each other." She paused. "The same way I—" She stopped. Let the sentence stay unfinished, because its completion was obvious, and she was not even now a woman who said everything that could be said. He understood. She could see it in his face. "Come to supper tonight," she said. "Actual supper. I'll make something." "Something you cook," he said very carefully. "Don't," she said. "I'm not saying anything." "Your face is saying something." "My face is completely neutral." "Your face," she said, "is doing exactly what it always does when you're being diplomatic about something you have strong opinions on." He laughed. Actually laughed. The full, unguarded version that she had come to understand was his rarest and most honest expression. She filed it away with the same care she brought to everything she valued. "I'll bring bread," he said. "That's a reasonable compromise," she agreed. The news moved through Willow Creek. The way all significant news moved fast, and with a level of elaboration that bore only a general relationship to the facts, but captured the emotional truth of them accurately enough. By afternoon, everyone knew that Victor Langley had settled, and the families had their land back, and the marshal's office was investigating. By evening, people were stopping Abigail on the street to say things to her, and she accepted those things with her characteristic composure, which meant she thanked people briefly and moved on without making a production of it. Hetty Crawford hugged her, which Abigail endured with more grace than she usually brought to being embraced by people because Hetty had earned it. Elias Pruitt shook her hand. His grip was stronger than a man his age had any right to, and his expression said everything his sparse words didn't. The two ranch hands who had worked the Mercer property since the previous spring, young men who had stayed through a difficult season and never once questioned whether their employer knew what she was doing, came to find her that evening and said simply that they were glad it had gone the way it went. "So am I," she told them. What she did not expect, the thing that arrived 3 days later and genuinely caught her off guard, was the letter. It came from a woman she had never met in a town 40 miles south. The woman's name was Martha Hale, and she had heard about what happened in Willow Creek, and she had a situation of her own, and she was writing because someone had told her that Abigail Mercer was a woman who understood how these things worked and might know what a widow alone was supposed to do when someone came after her land with paperwork that looked real and probably wasn't. Abigail read the letter twice. Then she sat down at Thomas's desk. The desk she had never replaced, never moved, had simply made her own by working at it every day until it felt less like his and more like theirs. A continuity between who he had been and what she had become, and she wrote back. She told Martha Hale to contact James Aldrich in Bozeman. She told her the specific things to document, the specific records to gather, the specific questions to ask that would reveal whether the debt claim was manufactured or real. She told her to be precise about language and not to use the word struggling because it permitted the wrong ending. She told her to find one person she trusted who could be in the room with her when things became difficult. Not to fight her battles, but to be a witness, because witnesses mattered, and no one should have to stand in those rooms alone. And at the bottom she wrote, "You are not a burden. You are not a problem. You are a person with rights and land and a future, and those things are worth defending. Defend them." She signed it, sealed it, sent it. Then she sat back in the chair and understood that this was what came next. Not a quiet settling into what she had won. Not a withdrawal into the private life she had protected so fiercely. Something outward. Something built from everything the last 2 years had cost her and taught her and made of her. She told Caleb about it that evening. He read Martha Hale's letter and handed it back without a word. Then he said, "How many women do you think are in that situation right now in this territory?" "More than anyone knows," she said. "And Langley wasn't the only one running these schemes." "No," she said. "He was just the most organized." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You're going to need James to be involved. And you're going to need relationships with people in the marshal's office now that this case has opened the door." "I know. And you're going to need money," he said. "Legal help for women who can't pay for it doesn't fund itself." "I know that too," she said. "I'm working on that part." He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand meant he was seeing her very clearly and very completely, and was finding nothing in what he saw that surprised him. "What do you need from me?" She met his eyes. "That question," she said. "Exactly that question. The fact that you ask what I need from you rather than telling me what you're going to do." He nodded slowly. "All right. What do you need from me?" "The Three Pines has more capital than the Mercer Ranch right now," she said. "Not a gift. A loan structured properly with terms we agree on between equals." "Done," he said immediately. "I haven't told you the amount yet." "It doesn't matter," he said. "Tell me the amount and we'll agree on terms and it'll be done." She looked at him for a moment. "You should probably negotiate," she said. "I'm a terrible negotiator when I've already decided something," he said. "Ask anyone. Anyone would tell me you're an excellent negotiator who has simply chosen not to be one right now." "They'd be right," he said. "Tell me the amount." She told him. He didn't flinch. Terms, he said. 5 years, she said. Standard interest. Paid from the proceeds of the ranch's operating revenue, not from any other source. 3 years, he said. Lower interest. And I reserve the right to reduce the balance if the ranch has a bad season. You do not get to reduce my debt without my consent, she said. Noted, he said. Then I reserve the right to propose reducing it and to be overruled by you when you refuse. She looked at him for a long moment. 5 years, she said. Original terms. Fine, he said, and smiled. She realized about 3 seconds later that he had never intended to win that negotiation. He had introduced a counteroffer purely to give her the satisfaction of holding her position and prevailing on it because he understood precisely completely, without her having to explain it, that her sense of what she owned and had earned was not something she could afford to have blurred even by generosity. You're a complicated man, she said. Straightforward, he said. You just pay attention. And that was the thing about Caleb Whitmore that she had understood for a while now and had taken her own time accepting he was not complicated at all. He was exactly what he presented himself to be: steady, dry, honest, patient, and possessed of a quiet, undemonstrative devotion that expressed itself not in declarations but in showing up. In reading a situation and responding to what it actually needed rather than what was easiest or most comfortable or most likely to be recognized as helpful. He had waited 6 hours at her gate. He had told her what he suspected about Thomas before he was certain and apologized for the delay. He had sat beside her in a barn while she felt something devastating and not tried to fix it or hurry it. He had negotiated alone in a way that preserved exactly the thing she needed to preserve. He was not saving her. He was paying attention to who she was. The difference she had finally and fully understood was everything. The first meeting of what would eventually become known informally at first, and then more formally as the months went on, as the Mercer Whitmore Land Protection Society. Though Abigail resisted that name for a long time because it sounded, she said, like something on a plaque in a building that was trying too hard, happened on a Thursday afternoon in October, 6 weeks after Langley's settlement. 7 women came, some from Willow Creek, some from as far as 60 miles away. Martha Hale came, which meant she had read Abigail's letter and gotten on a horse and ridden 40 miles on the strength of it. Cecilia Porter came, which did not surprise Abigail at all. Hetty Crawford came, which also did not surprise her. The others were women she had met through the network that had quietly assembled itself around the Langley case, women who had heard what happened in Willow Creek and recognized something in it that belonged to them too. They met in Abigail's kitchen, which was the largest indoor space on the Mercer Ranch, and was still considerably too small for 7 women, plus James Aldrich, who sat in the corner with a notepad and said very little and wrote down everything. Abigail stood at the head of the table, Thomas's table, her table, the table she had eaten at alone for 2 years, and she said, I want to start by being clear about what this is and what it isn't. The room was quiet. This isn't a charity, she said, and it isn't a rescue operation. I am not interested in rescuing anyone, and I don't imagine any of you are interested in being rescued. She looked around the table. At Martha Hale, who had come 40 miles on the strength of a letter. At Cecilia Porter, who had decided to stop being afraid. At the others, each carrying something, each managing it in their own way. What this is a resource, legal knowledge, documentation guidance. A network of people who understand how these schemes work and can help identify them before they get to the point where fighting back costs everything. And if it already has gotten to that point, one of the women asked. Her name was Ruth, and she had the specific careful stillness of someone who was already in trouble and had been for some time. Then we work with what's there, Abigail said. That's what James is for. She nodded at James, who tipped his head slightly. And that's what each other is for. You know things about your situation that I don't. I know things about mine. Between all of us, we know more than any of us does alone. The meeting lasted 3 hours. It was not smooth. There were disagreements and tears from Ruth that she clearly found mortifying, and the room around her handled with the particular grace of women who understood that tears were not weakness. They were simply what happened when the pressure that had been building for too long finally found a release valve. And there were moments where the conversation stalled on the practical reality that good intentions required money to function, and money was the thing none of them had in sufficient quantity. But when it was over, they had a plan. A real one. Specific, documented with James's name on the legal component and Abigail's name on the organizational one, and Caleb's loan underwriting the part that required capital before it could generate anything. As people were leaving, Martha Hale stopped at the door and turned back to Abigail with an expression that was complicated and grateful and something else. The specific look of a woman who has been trying to hold something together alone and has just realized she doesn't have to. "When I wrote to you," Martha said, "I didn't know if you'd write back." "I wrote back," Abigail said. "I know, I know." She stopped. "Why did you didn't know me?" Abigail thought about it honestly, the way she did all things. "Because someone should have written to me," she said. 2 years ago, when I was in your situation, someone should have written to me and told me that what I was trying to do was possible, that the knowledge existed and the legal recourse existed, and I wasn't the first person to face this particular kind of theft." She paused. "Nobody wrote. I figured it out anyway, but it took longer than it should have, and it cost more than it should have." She looked at Martha. "So I wrote back." Martha nodded. Went out. Caleb was the last one left. He had come mid-afternoon and sat out of the way and done the thing he was specifically good at, which was being present without taking up space that belonged to someone else. He picked up the extra chairs and stacked them while Abigail cleared the table, and they moved around each other in the kitchen with the ease of two people who had spent enough time in the same spaces that the choreography was automatic. 7 women, he said. 7 this time, she said. He looked at her. "It'll be more," she said. "The word is going to spread. James thinks we'll have inquiries from outside the territory within the year." She stacked the cups. "We're going to need a more formal structure, legal entity, documented processes." "I know a man in Helena," Caleb said. "Of course you do," she said. "I know a lot of people," he said. "It's a character trait." "It's a useful one," she said. And then Caleb. I want to ask you something." He stopped moving, looked at her. She set down the last cup and turned to face him fully, in the way she had of giving her complete attention to the things that deserved it. No partial focus, no hedging, no managing her own reaction before she knew what it was going to be. "You said weeks ago that you were asking whether there was room in my future for you," she said. "I said yes. I meant it. I still mean it." She looked at him steadily. "But I want you to know what you're choosing. Not the version that this month looks like with the settlement done, and the worst of it behind us, and everything feeling more possible than it did." She paused. "I mean the whole thing. The fact that I am going to keep building this, the network, the legal work, the assistance for women who need it, and it will sometimes be difficult and costly, and I will sometimes be exhausting to be around because I don't know how to do anything halfway." "I've noticed," he said. "I'm serious," she said. "So am I," he said. "I noticed, months ago. It's not a concern." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to need you to say more than that," she said. "I'm going to need you to tell me clearly that you understand that who I am is not a problem to be managed or a difficulty to be endured. That you're not here because you expect me to eventually become easier." His expression did not change dramatically, but something in it went very settled, the specific anchored look of a man who has considered a question fully and knows his answer down to the bone. "Abigail," he said, "I rode by your ranch for 3 months, looking for reasons that nobody would have believed. I waited 6 hours at your gate. I funded a land protection society from my operating capital. I have consumed more bad coffee than any man should reasonably be expected to endure." He stopped. "I am not here because I think you're going to become easier. I am here because of exactly who you are. The difficulty is not separate from the person. It's the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is the most accurate thing anyone has ever said to me." "I know," he said. "I've been paying attention." She crossed to him, stood in front of him in her own kitchen, in her own house, on her own land, and looked at him the way she had looked at things her whole life, directly, clearly, without flinching away from what was actually there. Then stay, she said. Not tonight specifically. Generally. Stay. I wasn't planning on going anywhere, he said. I know, she said. I needed to say it out loud. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the thing that had been there since that Wednesday morning with the broken wagon wheel and the axle pin patient, certain present. The look of a man who had understood something about her before she understood it about herself, and had waited without complaint or pressure or ultimatum for her to catch up. Then I'll stay, he said, plainly, completely. She nodded once, and she went back to finishing the dishes. He picked up a drying cloth and helped. The months that followed were not simple. Simple was not a thing the Montana Territory offered as a general condition, and the work Abigail had set herself was not the kind that became easier just because the worst threat had been removed. There were more letters, more women, more meetings, some in her kitchen, some in other kitchens, some in the offices of lawyers in towns she hadn't visited before. There were setbacks. A case they had thought was strong turned out to have a critical document missing. A woman they had been helping decided under renewed pressure from her family to sell after all, and Abigail had to make her peace with the fact that it was her choice to make and not Abigail's to override. There were also victories. Smaller than the Langley case, and quieter, and without the dramatic public resolution that had made Willow Creek watch with such attention. But real. A widow north of Billings who kept her land. A young woman who discovered through the documentation process James had formalized that the debt claim against her family's property had been manufactured from an entirely different scheme than Langley's, which led eventually to a second case and a second legal reckoning. Each one mattered. Caleb was there for all of it. Not leading it, that was not his role, and they both understood it clearly, but present. Managing the Three Pines, while also quietly, and without announcement, doing the things that needed doing in the background. The introductions to contacts in Helena. The conversations with suppliers who were making it difficult for women in the network to do business. The specific, efficient, low-drama problem-solving of a man who was very good at identifying the shape of a situation and responding to it without making the response about himself. He proposed in December. Not dramatically. They were doing something utterly ordinary. She was doing accounts at the desk. He was reading by the fire, and she had said something about the following spring's cattle plans, and he had responded, and they had talked for a while about the logistics of expanding the herd, and somewhere in the middle of that entirely practical conversation he had said without particular fanfare, "Marry me." She had looked up from the ledger. "What? Marry me," he said again. Same tone, same steadiness. "I've thought about it carefully, and the conclusion I keep reaching is that I want to be your husband, specifically yours, under your terms as you define them, which are terms I agree with entirely." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're proposing in the middle of a conversation about cattle," she said. "You were distracted by the ledger," he said. "I thought if I built up to it, you'd have time to prepare a reason to say not yet." She stared at him. "That's extremely calculated," she said. "I've mentioned I know how you work," he said. The corner of her mouth moved, then moved further, then broke into the full, rare, genuine smile that he had been collecting for months, the one she could never quite stop when it arrived, the one that was entirely unguarded and reached all the way up to her gray-green eyes. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he repeated. "Under my terms," she said. "Under your terms," he confirmed. "Exactly as stated. Two people who chose each other. Equals. And you are aware," she said, "that equals means you don't get to make decisions about what I should or shouldn't know." "I haven't done that since July," he said. "You've been very consistent," she agreed. "I'm a consistent man." "You are," she said. She set down her pen. "Yes, Caleb, I'll marry you." He didn't whoop or make a spectacle of it. He had never been a man for spectacle. He just looked at her with that settled, certain, anchored expression and said, "Good," and picked up his book. She looked at the side of his face for a long moment. "You're not going to make more of that," she said. "I got what I wanted," he said. "Making more of it would just be noise." She shook her head slowly. "I'm marrying a very strange man," she said. "You're marrying an accurate man," he said. "There's a difference." She laughed. She laughed in the way she always laughed, quickly, completely, as if the feeling had outrun her ability to contain it. And she turned back to her ledger, and he turned back to his book, and outside the Montana territory was dark and cold and enormous, and inside the Mercer Ranch was warm and ordinary and entirely, completely right. They married in February, the month Thomas had died, which was intentional. She chose it intentionally because she was a woman who had always been precise about what she did and why, and she wanted February to mean something different, now, not to erase what it had meant, but to hold both things at once, the way a life that has been through loss, and carried it honestly, eventually learns to hold both things at once. Hetty Crawford cried. Elias Pruitt did not cry, but shook Caleb's hand for an uncomfortably long time. Cecilia Porter came 60 miles to be there, which she had not announced in advance, and when Abigail saw her come through the door, she crossed the room and embraced her without saying anything, because some things don't have the right words and don't need them. James Aldrich was there. He brought documents. Someone made a joke about it. He didn't apologize. It was not a large or elaborate ceremony. It was exact and true. The way everything Abigail did was exact and true. And when it was over, she was Abigail Whitmore in law, and Abigail Mercer in the record she had built, and Abigail in the fundamental way that mattered most, unchanged in anything that was essential, with something new added that did not diminish what came before, but ran alongside it, like two rivers joining that are both still moving. Caleb looked at her after and said quietly, "You all right?" "Yes," she said, and she was. Years later, people in Willow Creek would tell the story of Abigail Mercer, the way towns tell the stories that become part of what they understand themselves to be. They would tell it not as a love story exactly, though it was that too, but as the story of a woman who refused to be defeated, not once dramatically in a single heroic moment, but daily, incrementally, post by post, with the same stubborn fidelity to doing the right and necessary thing that had built the territory itself. They would tell about the morning she slammed her fists on the council table with blood on her knuckles from an unfinished fence repair. They would tell about the letter she wrote back to Martha Hale. They would tell about the thing Caleb said that first day, which had become something of a local legend, precisely because it was so entirely the opposite of how men usually talk to women they were trying to impress. "I won't have to duel anyone for you," because he never had. Because she had never needed anyone to fight for her. She had needed someone willing to stand beside her while she fought for herself. And that the standing beside, the choosing deliberately, the building together as equals, was the thing that lasted. Not the drama of the courtroom, or the settlement, or Langley's name attached permanently to his crimes. Those were the events. The history. The thing that lasted was the daily, ordinary, irreplaceable choice to be in each other's lives. The ledgers done at the desk while he read by the fire. The terrible coffee she made, and the considerably better coffee he brought. The mornings before dawn in the barn, when neither of them needed to speak, because the work itself was the conversation. The thing that lasted was this. Abigail Mercer had survived every hard thing the world sent her, and she had done it on her own terms, and she had built from the wreckage something better than what the wreckage had replaced. Not a smaller, safer life. A larger one. Truer. Built by her own hands, chosen with her whole self, inhabited completely. She had not needed someone to complete her. She had only needed someone brave enough to recognize that she was already whole and wise enough and steady enough and patient enough to simply stand beside her and let that be enough. It was. It always had been. And in the wide, uncompromising valleys of the American West, where people lost everything and started again and lost again and started again. Abigail Mercer. Whitmore lived the rest of her life exactly as she had always lived it, on her own terms, with her eyes open, and without ever once apologizing for being exactly, completely, fully herself. That was the greatest thing she ever built, and nobody could take it from her.